If you enjoyed this interesting video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you even more exciting and thought-provoking content. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Join our growing community today. Your feedback, comments, and ideas truly keep this channel alive.
Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 1. The Birth of a Future Emperor. In the heart of Shua, a rugged and mountainous region of Ethiopia, a child was born on August 17, 1844. His name was Salam-Mariam, but the world would come to know him as Menelik II, the emperor who stood against European colonization and etched his name in the pages of African history. At the time of his birth, Ethiopia was a patchwork of rival kingdoms and noble houses, all vying for power. Foreign powers such as Britain, France, and Italy were circling the African continent, carving territories for their empires. None of this was known to the infant child, but destiny had already placed him on a path that would shape the future of his land. Salam-Mariam was born into royalty. His father, Haile Melekot, was the king of Shua, a province with a long tradition of independence and military strength. His mother, Ejugea, was not of noble rank, which gave his birth a complicated status in the eyes of the Ethiopian elite. Still, his father recognized him as a legitimate heir. When Haile Melekot died in 1855, the young boy was just 11 years old. The throne of Shua was his by blood, but Ethiopia was not a land where inheritance was simple. At that time, Emperor Tawadros II ruled Ethiopia with an iron hand. He was determined to unify the fragmented empire and demanded loyalty from every noble house. When news of King Haile Melekot's death reached Tawadros, he acted swiftly. The boy prince was taken from Shua to the imperial court. This move was both political and personal. Tawadros wanted to control Shua and also ensure that no rival would rise from there. For the young Salam-Mariam, this was the beginning of a difficult childhood. Instead of being raised as a free king in his homeland, he grew up as a captive at the emperor's court. He was given the title Menelik, after a legendary son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, linking him to Ethiopia's sacred history. But titles did not soften his captivity. Menelik lived under constant watch, surrounded by guards, knowing that his father's kingdom had been taken and his people were waiting for his return. Yet captivity shaped him in ways that would prove essential later. Menelik was a quick learner, curious about everything. He studied Ethiopia's traditions, laws, and military practices. He watched the politics of the imperial court and began to understand the balance of power, loyalty, and betrayal. While many young princes might have broken under the weight of captivity, Menelik grew stronger. Inside him burned the desire not just to reclaim Shua but to restore Ethiopia's dignity. His chance came in 1865. Menelik, now a young man of 21, managed to escape from captivity. His flight was daring, the kind of story that spread like wildfire among Ethiopians. With only a small band of loyal followers, he made his way back to Shua. The people of his province welcomed him as their rightful king, and soon he was crowned as Negus of Shua. This moment marked the beginning of his rise to power. Menelik quickly proved himself as a ruler. He strengthened Shua's military, re-established its independence, and expanded its influence over neighboring regions. He understood the importance of modern weapons and sought trade and diplomacy with European powers to secure them. Unlike many African rulers of his time, Menelik did not isolate his kingdom. He welcomed foreign technologies and ideas, but he did so on his own terms. He would modernize Shua, but never surrender it. This balance between tradition and progress would define his rule. Menelik was deeply rooted in Ethiopia's Orthodox Christian faith and culture, but he was also forward-looking, determined to arm his people with the tools needed to survive in a changing world. As Shua grew stronger, it was clear that Menelik was destined for more than just ruling a province. The rest of Ethiopia was restless. Emperor Tawadros II's harsh rule led to rebellions. After his death in 1868, the empire entered a period of turbulence, with rival leaders fighting for the throne. Menelik watched, waited, and expanded his power patiently. He understood that to claim the imperial crown, He needed not just force but also legitimacy, alliances, and the loyalty of Ethiopia's diverse peoples. By the late 19th century, the winds of change were sweeping across Africa. European nations had gathered at the Berlin Conference of 1884–85 and divided the continent among themselves. Italy, eager to join the ranks of imperial powers, set its eyes on Ethiopia. What they did not know was that Ethiopia was not a land waiting to be conquered. It was a proud kingdom, led by a man who had survived captivity, reclaimed his throne, and was preparing for something greater. The boy born in Shua, once a prisoner of emperors, was now a king in his own right. Soon, he would become an emperor. And soon, the world would know his name not just as Menelik, but as Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 2. The Road to the Throne of Ethiopia. When Menelik escaped captivity and reclaimed his seat as king of Shua in 1865, it was more than just the return of a prince to his homeland. It was the beginning of a transformation that would turn Ethiopia into one of the only African nations to resist European colonization. In this chapter, we see how Menelik II built his strength, outmaneuvered rivals, and set his sights on the throne of Ethiopia. Shua was not the richest province of Ethiopia, nor was it the most powerful when Menelik began his reign. But it was strategically placed and blessed with ambitious leaders. Menelik quickly understood that to survive, Shua needed more than tradition. He began building alliances through diplomacy, marriages, and military campaigns. Unlike many kings of his time who relied only on brute force, Menelik played the long game. He cultivated friendships with powerful nobles and ensured that Shua's soldiers were well armed and disciplined. One of his first priorities was modern weapons. The world was changing fast in the second half of the 19th century. European armies carried rifles, artillery, and advanced technology. Menelik saw what happened to African kingdoms that resisted without modern tools. They were swept aside by colonial armies. He decided that Shua would not share that fate. By establishing trade connections with Europeans, he secured firearms, ammunition, and even artillery. But he was careful. He took weapons, not foreign control. He welcomed advice, but not rulers. This careful balance between diplomacy and independence became Menelik's greatest strength. Foreign traders saw him as approachable and cooperative, while his people saw him as strong and uncompromising. In the highlands of Shua, his authority grew, and his soldiers became known for their discipline and courage. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian Empire beyond Shua was unstable. After the death of Emperor Tawadros II in 1868, the throne was contested by several leaders. Johannes IV eventually rose to power in 1872, ruling from the north. Menelik, as king of Shua, pledged loyalty to Johannes but never abandoned his own ambitions. It was a delicate balance. Johannes was a powerful emperor, but he faced constant threats from outside and within. Menelik knew his time would come, and so he waited, strengthening his position year after year. During Johannes's reign, Menelik expanded Shua's territory. He conquered nearby regions like Arsi and Sidamo, extending his kingdom's reach. His armies marched far, defeating local chiefs and integrating their lands into Shua. This expansion was not just about territory, it gave Menelik more soldiers, more resources, and more legitimacy as a leader. By the 1880s, he was no longer just a regional king. He was a national figure, respected and feared across Ethiopia. When Johannes IV died in 1889 after a battle against the Mahdaists of Sudan, the empire was left without a strong leader. This was the moment Menelik had been waiting for. With skill and speed, he declared himself Emperor of Ethiopia. On November 3, 1889, he was crowned as Menelik II, Emperor of Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. His coronation was more than a political act, it was the rebirth of Ethiopia as a unified and modern nation. But Menelik's path to power was not without its challenges. Italy, a young European kingdom hungry for colonies, had been negotiating with Ethiopia. In 1889, Menelik signed the Treaty of Wuchel with Italy, thinking it was a mutual agreement of friendship and trade. The Amharic version of the treaty stated that Ethiopia could use Italy as a diplomatic channel with other European powers if it chose to. But the Italian version twisted the words to claim that Ethiopia had become an Italian protectorate. This trick would soon bring Italy into direct conflict with Menelik and his people. But before that storm broke, Menelik focused on consolidating his throne. He built Addis Ababa into a capital city, established Ethiopia's first modern institutions, and continued to expand his borders. He also relied on his brilliant wife, Empress Taytu Batul, who was not only a strong partner but also a sharp political strategist. Together, they created a court that combined tradition with progress. Menelik II was no ordinary ruler. Unlike many African kings who reacted too late to European colonial aggression, he anticipated it. He knew that Ethiopia's survival depended on unity, strength, and modernization. He used diplomacy when it benefited him, but he was not afraid of war. He encouraged his people to see themselves as one nation, not just separate provinces, and he constantly reminded them of their proud history as the heirs of Solomon and Sheba. As the 1890s approached, the stage was set. Italy believed Ethiopia was theirs to control. Menelik knew otherwise. His childhood in captivity had taught him the value of patience. His years as king of Shua had taught him the importance of strength. Now, as emperor, he would face his greatest test. The Battle of Adwa was on the horizon, and the world would soon witness the courage of Ethiopia under Menelik II. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 3. Building a Modern Ethiopia. When Menelik II was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia in 1889, he knew the challenges ahead would not be easy. He had taken the throne in a time of great uncertainty. The European powers had divided Africa during the Berlin Conference, and Ethiopia was surrounded by colonies. To the north, Italy had claimed Eritrea. To the east, Britain controlled Sudan and Somaliland. To the south, powerful European traders and settlers were expanding into East Africa. Ethiopia stood as one of the last free kingdoms on the continent. Menelik understood this reality better than anyone. Unlike rulers who clung to old traditions alone, he believed survival meant modernization. Ethiopia's history was ancient and proud, but to withstand European pressure, it needed new tools, new systems, and new ways of organizing society. This belief drove him to launch one of the most ambitious modernization projects in Africa during the 19th century. The first priority was the military. Menelik had seen how European armies crushed African kingdoms with rifles, machine guns, and artillery. He knew bravery was not enough. Ethiopia's soldiers needed modern weapons. Through careful diplomacy, Menelik purchased rifles, ammunition, and cannons from France and Russia, sometimes even from Italy itself before relations collapsed. By the 1890s, Ethiopia's army was no longer a medieval force but one of the most formidable in Africa, trained and armed for the modern battlefield. At the same time, Menelik expanded Ethiopia's borders. Through military campaigns, he incorporated regions like Harar, Kaffa, Arsi, and Sidamo into the empire. This expansion was not simply about conquest, it brought in new populations, resources, and tax revenues. It also helped create the foundation of modern Ethiopia's territory. Every victory added to Menelik's prestige, and by the early 1890s, he was recognized as the most powerful ruler in the Horn of Africa. But modernization under Menelik was not only about weapons and land. He wanted Ethiopia to step onto the world stage as a respected nation. He encouraged the construction of new roads and trade routes to link different regions of the empire. Addis Ababa, which he had chosen as his capital, began to grow into a vibrant city. Foreign embassies opened there, and diplomats arrived to negotiate with the emperor. Ethiopia was no longer isolated. It was becoming a recognized force in global politics. Menelik also introduced new technologies. He supported the building of telegraph lines to improve communication across the empire. He gave permission for the first railway line, linking Addis Ababa to the French-controlled port of Djibouti, which would allow Ethiopia greater access to global trade. He even encouraged banking and currency reforms, laying the foundation for Ethiopia's economic development. For a country surrounded by colonized neighbors, these changes were revolutionary. Yet Menelik never forgot his roots. While he embraced modern tools, he also preserved Ethiopia's traditions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church remained central to national identity, and Menelik drew legitimacy from its blessing. He presented himself as the defender of the faith, a king chosen by God in the line of Solomon and Sheba. This dual image, a modernizing emperor and a traditional defender, gave him unmatched authority at home and respect abroad. Still, tensions with Italy were growing. The Treaty of Wuchel, signed in 1889, had been a trap. The Italian version claimed Ethiopia had agreed to become a protectorate, while the Amharic version gave Ethiopia the right to use Italy as a diplomatic channel if it wished. When Menelik discovered the deceit, he refused to accept it. Italy, however, insisted that Ethiopia was under its control. This misunderstanding was not a small matter. It was a direct challenge to Ethiopian sovereignty. The conflict became unavoidable. Italy believed it could defeat Ethiopia easily, as it had done in Eritrea. Many Europeans also assumed that no African army could stand against the European one. Menelik, however, was not intimidated. He called upon his people, uniting Ethiopians of all regions under one banner. His wife, Empress Taytu Batul, played a crucial role, rallying nobles and soldiers alike, reminding them that Ethiopia's independence was at stake. By the mid-1890s, Ethiopia was preparing for war. Menelik gathered one of the largest armies Africa had ever seen, estimated at over 100,000 soldiers. They were armed with modern rifles, but more importantly, they were united by purpose. For Menelik, this was not just about defending land. It was about defending Ethiopia's dignity, its faith, and its right to exist as a free nation. In villages and cities across the empire, men answered his call. Farmers left their fields, hunters brought their weapons, and nobles gathered their retainers. The Ethiopian flag was raised high, and drums of war echoed through the highlands. Every soldier understood the stakes. If Ethiopia fell, it would be swallowed by colonial rule like the rest of Africa. As the Italian forces advanced from Eritrea, Menelik prepared to meet them head-on. He was no longer the boy who had grown up in captivity, nor just the king of a province. He was now the emperor of a proud and united nation. The coming clash would decide Ethiopia's fate, and Menelik was ready. The world was about to witness something extraordinary. Against all expectations, an African army was preparing to stand against the European Empire. The stage was set for the Battle of Adwa, and Menelik II would lead his people into history. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 4. The Battle That Shook an Empire. The morning of March 1, 1896, dawned over the rugged mountains of Adwa in northern Ethiopia. The sky was streaked with gray clouds, and the air was heavy with anticipation. On that day, the fate of Ethiopia, and perhaps the dignity of Africa itself, would be decided. Menelik II, Emperor of Ethiopia, stood at the head of one of the largest armies the continent had ever assembled. Before him lay the invading Italian force, confident in its modern training and European superiority. The two sides were about to clash in a battle that would change history. The road to Adwa. The war had begun after Menelik rejected Italy's claim that Ethiopia was its protectorate under the Treaty of Wuchel. To Menelik, this was not just a legal disagreement. It was an insult to Ethiopia's independence, a direct attempt to strip away centuries of sovereignty. Italy, seeking to expand its colonial possessions in East Africa, believed Ethiopia could be brought to heel by force. By early 1896, Italian General Oris Baratieri led nearly 18,000 troops into the highlands, supported by artillery and supplies. Many European observers assumed this would be another easy victory for a colonial power. After all, across the continent, European armies had crushed local resistance with rifles and cannons. What they underestimated was Ethiopia's unity, Menelik's leadership, and the determination of a people unwilling to surrender. Menelik had spent months preparing for this moment. He called upon Ethiopia's nobles, warriors, and common men alike. From Shua, Tigray, Gajem, and beyond, soldiers gathered, answering the emperor's call. It is said more than 100,000 Ethiopians stood ready to fight, armed with rifles, spears, shields, and an unbreakable will. Alongside him was his wife, Empress Teitu, who not only inspired the troops but also commanded forces in the field. The battle begins. At dawn on March 1st, the Italians advanced, expecting to catch the Ethiopians off guard. But Menelik had studied the terrain carefully. The mountains and valleys around Adwa gave his forces the advantage. He spread his armies across the high ground, surrounding the Italian columns as they moved forward. The first clashes were fierce. Ethiopian warriors charged downhill with cries that echoed across the battlefield. Some carried modern rifles, firing in volleys, while others wielded spears and swords, closing the distance with ferocity. The Italians, disciplined and heavily armed, responded with rifle fire and artillery shells. But they were outnumbered, and their formations quickly began to crumble under the relentless pressure. Menelik himself stood at the center of command, directing movements and rallying his men. He was not the type of emperor to hide behind palace walls. On the battlefield, he inspired loyalty. Soldiers who saw him knew they were fighting for more than a crown. They were fighting for their country's very existence. Empress Teitu's role. One of the most remarkable figures at Adwa was Empress Teitu. She commanded thousands of troops and organized the defense of strategic positions. Her presence reminded the soldiers that this was not just a man's war, but a national struggle involving every Ethiopian. She also oversaw logistics, ensuring water supplies and morale were maintained during the long campaign. In every sense, she was a warrior queen, standing beside Menelik as his equal in the fight for independence. The turning point. As the day wore on, the Italians began to falter. Their plan had been to divide and conquer, but instead, they found themselves divided and overwhelmed. Ethiopian forces pressed in from all sides, cutting off retreat and surrounding enemy units. Whole Italian battalions were destroyed, their soldiers either killed or taken prisoner. By midday, the outcome was clear. The Italian army was in full retreat, leaving behind cannons, rifles, and supplies. The battlefield was littered with the signs of defeat: broken lines, shattered morale, and abandoned equipment. Menelik's forces had not only resisted but crushed one of Europe's modern armies. Victory at Adwa. The victory was total. Of the Italian force, thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Ethiopia had lost many brave warriors, but it had achieved something no other African nation had done in that era. It had decisively defeated a European empire in open battle. News of the Battle of Adwa spread quickly across the world. In Europe, it was a shock. Newspapers carried headlines about the humiliating defeat of Italy. For Africans and the African diaspora, Adwa became a beacon of hope, proof that colonialism was not unstoppable. In countries as far away as the United States and the Caribbean, people of African descent celebrated Menelik's triumph. Ethiopia became a symbol of freedom, a living reminder that African nations could resist and win. Menelik's legacy secured. For Menelik too, the victory at Adwa secured his legacy. Ethiopia's independence was guaranteed, and Italy was forced to recognize Ethiopia as a sovereign nation. The emperor had done more than defend his crown, he had defended the dignity of his people. But Menelik knew the work was not over. Adwa had given Ethiopia security, but it also placed new responsibilities on his shoulders. He had to continue strengthening his nation, modernizing its institutions, and preparing for future challenges. For now, though, he stood as the Lion of Adwa, the emperor who had humbled an empire. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 5. After Adwa. Securing Ethiopia's future. The echoes of the Battle of Adwa in 1896 did not fade quickly. Ethiopia's victory over Italy had shaken Europe and electrified Africa. While Italy licked its wounds, Emperor Menelik II turned to the next stage of his mission. Winning the battle had secured Ethiopia's independence, but keeping it would require wisdom, strength, and careful diplomacy. Menelik understood that Adwa was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of a new era. The global shockwave. The immediate effect of Adwa was international recognition. European powers that had once dismissed Ethiopia as backward were now forced to take it seriously. Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa in October 1896, formally recognizing Ethiopia's independence and revising its claims. Other nations quickly followed. Britain, France, and even Russia sought alliances and trade with Menelik. Ethiopia, once viewed as a remote highland kingdom, had entered the global stage as an equal. For Africans across the continent, Adwa became a legend. In colonized lands, whispers spread: if Ethiopia could resist, maybe others could too. Menelik too was celebrated as a hero not just in his homeland but across Africa and the African diaspora. Newspapers in America praised him, while leaders of Pan-African movements pointed to Ethiopia as proof that freedom could be defended. Consolidating power at home. Menelik, however, knew that military glory alone was not enough. After Adwa, he turned his focus inward. Ethiopia was vast and diverse, with many regions newly brought under imperial control. To ensure stability, he needed to govern wisely. He appointed loyal governors over regions like Harar, Kaffa, and Sidamo, integrating them into the empire. These areas brought wealth in the form of trade, coffee, and resources, but they also brought challenges. Local populations needed to be respected and managed carefully to prevent rebellion. Menelik balanced firmness with diplomacy, relying on traditional authority structures while strengthening the central government. Addis Ababa, the capital he had chosen, grew rapidly in this period. It became not just the seat of power but also a symbol of Ethiopia's unity. Roads linked the city to distant provinces, markets bustled with goods, and foreign envoys arrived to negotiate treaties. The capital became the heart of Menelik's empire. Modernization and progress. Menelik II's vision extended beyond military strength. He wanted Ethiopia to modernize while maintaining its independence. He encouraged the introduction of new technologies that could strengthen the nation. Telegraph lines were extended to connect distant parts of the empire. The construction of the Addis Ababa, Djibouti Railway, started under his reign, promised to link landlocked Ethiopia to the sea and open it to global trade. He also promoted the use of modern medicine, welcomed foreign doctors, and supported the opening of schools. Banking reforms were introduced, and Ethiopia's first modern currency, the bear, was minted during his reign. These changes were slow and sometimes resisted by traditionalists, but Menelik's authority allowed him to push them forward. Still, Menelik was careful not to let modernization erode Ethiopia's identity. He remained deeply tied to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which gave legitimacy to his rule. He balanced the adoption of foreign innovations with the preservation of tradition, ensuring that his people felt proud of their heritage even as they adapted to a changing world. Diplomacy with Europe. After Adwa, Menelik played European powers against each other skillfully. He welcomed embassies from France, Britain, and Russia, all of whom now wanted Ethiopia as a partner. By keeping them competing for his favor, he prevented any single power from dominating his country. Italy, humiliated but still clinging to its colony in Eritrea, remained a neighbor and potential threat. Menelik maintained a cautious peace with them, neither provoking nor fully trusting. His goal was always to protect Ethiopia's sovereignty while avoiding unnecessary wars. The symbol of Adwa. Even as he focused on governance, the memory of Adwa loomed large. The battle became a symbol for Ethiopians of every background. It reminded them that they were part of something greater, a free nation in a colonized continent. Every year, the victory was celebrated, strengthening national unity and pride. Menelik himself was hailed as the Lion of Adwa. Yet he remained pragmatic. He knew Ethiopia's survival depended not only on past victories but also on future preparation. He warned his nobles that unity was essential, that the empire must never fall back into division, or foreign powers would take advantage. Preparing for the future. The years after Adwa were a golden period for Ethiopia. It was one of the only African nations to stand as an equal among European states. Menelik's policies of modernization, expansion, and diplomacy gave Ethiopia a stronger foundation than it had ever known. But Menelik was also aging. The strain of ruling a vast empire and the health issues that would later trouble him were beginning to show. Still, he pressed forward, determined to secure Ethiopia's place in history. For now, his country was safe. The roar of victory at Adwa still echoed across the mountains, and the emperor sat proudly in Addis Ababa, overseeing a nation that had humbled an empire. But new challenges, both internal and external, waited on the horizon. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 6. The emperor's later years and struggles. By the dawn of the 20th century, Menelik II had already secured his place in history. The victory at Adwa in 1896 was still celebrated across Ethiopia, and his modernization projects had given the nation a stronger foundation than ever before. But as the years passed, the emperor who had once seemed unstoppable began to face new challenges. These were not battles fought with rifles and swords, but struggles against illness, political rivalries, and the weight of ruling a vast and diverse empire. Continuing the work of modernization. Even after Adwa, Menelik remained committed to strengthening Ethiopia. He believed that the survival of the nation depended on continued progress. The construction of the Addis Ababa Djibouti Railway became one of his major priorities. Though expensive and controversial, the railway promised to connect Ethiopia directly to the sea, boosting trade and reducing dependence on neighboring colonies controlled by European powers. Menelik also continued to introduce new institutions. He encouraged the establishment of modern schools, hoping to train a new generation of Ethiopians who could serve as administrators, diplomats, and military officers. He also introduced Ethiopia's first postal system, expanded telegraph lines, and worked to develop Addis Ababa into a true capital city. Markets thrived, foreign embassies multiplied, and Ethiopia's reputation as a strong and independent African state grew. His reign also saw the minting of Ethiopia's modern currency, the Ethiopian birr, which gave the empire greater control over trade and finance. He founded the Bank of Abyssinia in 1905, with foreign assistance, laying the foundation for a modern financial system. For a country that had long relied on barter and coinage from other lands, this was a transformative step. The shadow of illness. But while the empire moved forward, Menelik's health began to decline. In 1906, he suffered his first major stroke. Though he recovered enough to continue ruling, the illness weakened him and left him vulnerable to further attacks. By 1909, after another series of strokes, he was largely paralyzed and unable to speak. This created a vacuum in leadership. Ethiopia's emperor, the man who had led the nation at Adwa and stood as a symbol of African independence, could no longer command directly. The empire still looked to him with reverence, but in practical terms, others began to step in to manage state affairs. The role of Empress Taytu. Among those who stepped forward, none was more powerful than Empress Taytu Batul. She had always been more than just Menelik's wife. Sharp, politically astute, and unafraid of confrontation, Taytu had played a key role during the Battle of Adwa and in Ethiopia's administration. Now, with Menelik incapacitated, she took on even greater responsibility. Taytu effectively became the empire's de facto ruler. She managed court politics, directed diplomacy, and oversaw governance. Many admired her intelligence and strength, but her dominance also created friction. Some nobles resented her influence, seeing her as too controlling and unwilling to share power. Disputes within the court began to grow, threatening the stability Menelik had worked so hard to build. Foreign relations and internal tensions. During these years, Ethiopia remained under international attention. European powers still surrounded it, each hoping to expand their influence. Britain, France, and Italy all maintained interests in the Horn of Africa. Menelik's earlier diplomacy had ensured Ethiopia was respected, but with his illness, foreign envoys watched closely, wondering if the empire would weaken. Inside Ethiopia, the challenge of ruling a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire continued. While Menelik's earlier conquests had expanded Ethiopia's territory, they also brought new populations under imperial control. Governing these regions required careful balance. Rebellions occasionally flared, and some local leaders resisted central authority. With Menelik too ill to intervene directly, managing these tensions became more difficult. The question of succession. Perhaps the most pressing issue in Menelik's later years was the question of succession. He had no surviving sons, and Ethiopia's tradition of royal inheritance was complex. Several candidates had claims, including relatives from different branches of the royal family. Empress Tatu supported her own preferred heirs, while other nobles backed different figures. This uncertainty created divisions at court. Everyone knew Menelik's time was drawing to a close, and everyone wanted to ensure their influence in the future. It was a dangerous situation, for if the empire fractured after Menelik's death, the gains of Adwa and modernization could be undone. The emperor's quiet strength. Even as illness silenced him, Menelik's presence remained powerful. He was deeply respected by his people, who saw him as the defender of Ethiopia's independence. In Addis Ababa, crowds still gathered to hear news of his health, and stories of his achievements continued to inspire. Though unable to speak, he was still the emperor in the hearts of his people. By 1910, Ethiopia was in a delicate state. It had modern institutions, a growing economy, and international recognition. But it also faced internal rivalries, leadership struggles, and uncertainty about the future. Menelik's reign was drawing to a close, but his legacy was already secure. He had given Ethiopia something no other African nation had achieved in that era: victory against colonization and survival as an independent state. As his health declined further, Ethiopia entered a period of transition. The Lion of Adwa, once the commanding voice of resistance, was now a silent figure in the palace. Yet his shadow loomed large, reminding everyone that the strength of Ethiopia lay not in one man alone but in the spirit of a united people. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 7. Succession Struggles and Shifting Power. By the early 1910s, Ethiopia found itself at a crossroads. Emperor Menelik II was still alive, but his illness had left him silent and withdrawn, unable to rule. The nation that he had defended and modernized now faced the difficult question of who would succeed him. This was not a simple matter of royal inheritance. In Ethiopia, the monarchy was shaped by custom, noble alliances, and political maneuvering. With so much at stake, tensions at the imperial court began to rise. The empress in command, Empress Tatu Batul, Menelik's powerful and intelligent wife, took charge as the emperor's health worsened. She had already been deeply involved in state affairs and had proven her leadership during the Battle of Adwa. Now, she became the de facto ruler of Ethiopia, issuing orders in the emperor's name. Tatu was respected, but she was also controversial. She favored her own family members for positions of influence, and she was not afraid to clash with powerful nobles. Many saw her as a strong guardian of Menelik's legacy, but others accused her of being too ambitious. The court split into factions, those who supported Tatu and those who sought to reduce her control. Lij Iyasu, the chosen heir. Before his illness, Menelik II had named his grandson, Lij Iyasu, as his successor. Iyasu was the son of Ras Michael of Wallo, a powerful Muslim leader, and Menelik's daughter Shawarga Menelik. This made him a legitimate heir, though not without controversy. Iyasu was young, energetic, and unconventional. When Menelik's health failed, Iyasu was recognized as heir apparent, though he never officially received the crown while Menelik was alive. His rise alarmed some nobles, particularly because of his father's Muslim background. Ethiopia was a deeply Christian empire, and many in the Orthodox Church worried that Iyasu might weaken the Church's central role in the state. Still, for the time being, Iyasu represented continuity. Menelik's authority remained unchallenged in name, and Iyasu's claim gave the court a direction. But it was clear to everyone that Ethiopia's future was about to change. Court rivalries and political tensions. The years between 1910 and 1913 were marked by political intrigue. While Menelik lived, even in silence, his presence held the empire together. But behind the palace walls, rival groups plotted their influence in the next era. Some supported Empress Tatu, believing she was best positioned to maintain stability. Others rallied behind Lige Iassu, eager for a younger and more dynamic ruler. A third group began to emerge, one that looked beyond both Tetu and Iassu. They placed their hopes in a young noble named Ras Tafari Makoan, who would one day become Emperor Haile Selassie. Ras Tafari was still in his 20s, but he was gaining attention for his intelligence, diplomacy, and ability to work with both Ethiopian nobles and foreign powers. Though not yet a central figure, he was quietly building a reputation that would shape Ethiopia's destiny. Foreign powers watching closely. The succession struggles in Ethiopia were not only a domestic affair. European powers kept a close eye on the empire. Italy, still smarting from its defeat at Adwa, hoped Ethiopia would weaken after Menelik's death. Britain and France, with colonies bordering Ethiopian lands, also watched with interest, eager to expand their influence if instability gave them an opening. This foreign pressure made the succession issue even more urgent. Ethiopia could not afford to descend into civil strife. A divided empire might lose everything Menelik had fought for at Adwa. The emperor's final days. Menelik too lingered for years after his strokes, watched over by Tetu and his court. Though he could not speak or move freely, his symbolic presence kept Ethiopia from outright collapse. Nobles continued to show him respect, and his people continued to honor him as the great defender of their land. By 1913, however, it was clear that the end was near. Menelik's long illness had taken its toll, and whispers spread through Addis Ababa that the emperor's final days were at hand. A nation on edge. As Menelik's life drew to a close, Ethiopia stood on the edge of uncertainty. Would the empire accept Lige Iassu as the rightful successor, despite doubts about his background and leadership style? Would Empress Tetu continue to dominate the court? Or would rising figures like Ras Tafari gain the upper hand? The story of Menelik II was nearing its conclusion, but the legacy of his reign would shape everything that followed. Ethiopia had resisted colonization, modernized its institutions, and stood proudly as an independent African power. Yet the battles ahead, political, religious, and diplomatic, would test whether that legacy could endure without the Lion of Adwa himself. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 8. The Passing of the Emperor and the Rise of Lige Iassu. On December 12, 1913, the bells of Addis Ababa tolled with a heavy sound. Emperor Menelik II, the man who had humbled an empire at Adwa and defended Ethiopia's independence, was dead. For years, he had lived in silence, struck down by illness. His people had prayed for his recovery, but the day finally came when Ethiopia lost its greatest ruler. The mourning was immense. Menelik was not only an emperor but also a symbol of resistance for all Africa. At his funeral, priests of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church chanted prayers, nobles dressed in black gathered in the capital, and common citizens filled the streets, weeping for their Lion of Adwa. With his passing, Ethiopia entered a new and uncertain chapter. The young emperor, Lige Iassu. Even before Menelik's death, Lige Iassu had been recognized as his heir. Now, in the eyes of many, he was the rightful leader of Ethiopia. At just 17 years old when he was declared successor, Iassu was bold, energetic, and full of ambition. He wanted to transform Ethiopia in his own way. But almost immediately, his reign began to stir controversy. Unlike Menelik, who had skillfully balanced tradition with modernization, Iassu appeared impulsive. He admired aspects of both Ethiopian and foreign cultures but often acted without the caution that had guided his grandfather. A controversial legacy. One of the sharpest points of conflict was Iassu's relationship with Islam. His father, Ras Michael of Wallo, was Muslim, and Iassu himself seemed more open to Islam than many expected. Reports spread that he dressed in Muslim attire, visited mosques, and associated with Muslim leaders. To some Ethiopians, this was not a problem. Ethiopia was home to both Christians and Muslims, and Menelik himself had ruled all subjects equally. But for the Orthodox Church, Iassu's behavior was alarming. The Church was the backbone of the Ethiopian monarchy, and any sign that the emperor might weaken its power was seen as dangerous. Foreign powers, too, watched Iassu's actions with suspicion. Italy and Britain, both with colonial interests in the region, hoped to find cracks in Ethiopia's unity. Rumors that Iyasu might convert to Islam or align with Muslim leaders gave them reasons to doubt his stability. Tetu's waning influence. While Iyasu claimed power, Empress Tetu remained in the background. She was still respected, but her authority had faded after Menelik's death. The court no longer revolved around her, and many nobles were eager to distance themselves from her control. Ethiopia had entered a new era, and Tetu's time as the empire's political guardian was closing. Still, her presence was a reminder of Menelik's legacy. She remained a symbol of the old guard, of the emperor who had beaten the Italians and modernized Ethiopia. The empire restless. Iyasu's reign coincided with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Ethiopia was not directly involved, but the conflict reshaped global politics. Iyasu, perhaps out of youthful defiance, leaned toward the Ottoman Empire and Germany, who opposed Britain, France, and Italy. This alarmed the Allied powers, who had influence in Africa. They saw Iyasu as unpredictable, possibly even a threat to their colonial holdings. Inside Ethiopia, his erratic behavior, combined with these alliances, created unease among nobles and clergy. A growing opposition. By 1915, whispers began to grow in the court. Nobles, generals, and church leaders questioned whether Iyasu was fit to rule. Unlike Menelik II, who had commanded loyalty through victories and wisdom, Iyasu lacked a unifying achievement. His controversial policies gave his enemies ammunition. Opponents quietly began plotting his removal. They argued that Ethiopia needed stability, especially with powerful European empires surrounding it. Many looked for an alternative ruler, someone with both legitimacy and the qualities of a steady leader. The shadow of Ras Tafari. During this time, Ras Tafari Makoan continued to rise in prominence. The son of Ras Makoan of Harar, he had been educated, disciplined, and carefully observant of politics. While Iyasu stumbled, Tafari built alliances with nobles, gained the trust of the church, and impressed foreign diplomats with his modern outlook. Though still in his 20s, Tafari was increasingly seen as the future. His calm nature and vision for modernization contrasted sharply with Iyasu's unpredictability. Ethiopia at a crossroads. By the end of 1916, the empire stood divided. On one side was Iyasu, young, energetic, but reckless and controversial. On the other were the nobles and clergy, determined to protect Menelik's legacy and Ethiopia's Christian monarchy. And rising quietly in the background was Ras Tafari, who would soon step forward as a central figure in Ethiopian history. The Lion of Adwa was gone, and Ethiopia faced the test of whether it could endure without his guiding hand. The next years would bring struggle, betrayal, and the dramatic fall of Menelik's heir. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 9. The fall of Lij Iyasu and the rise of Ras Tafari. By 1916, Ethiopia stood at a breaking point. Menelik II's death had left a power vacuum, and his grandson Lij Iyasu had failed to fill it with authority. His controversial choices, his flirtation with Islam, and his unpredictable behavior had eroded confidence among the nobility, the Orthodox Church, and foreign powers. To many, Iyasu was no longer seen as the heir of Menelik but as a reckless youth who threatened the stability of the empire. The breaking of trust. The final blow came in September 1916. Reports spread that Lij Iyasu had openly embraced Islam, even attending prayers at a mosque and wearing Muslim robes. Whether this was truth or rumor hardly mattered. For the Orthodox Church, it was intolerable. The Church had long been the backbone of Ethiopia's monarchy, and the idea of an emperor abandoning the faith was unthinkable. The nobles and high-ranking clergy, already uneasy, decided to act. They believed Ethiopia's independence, secured at Adwa by Menelik, was now at risk under Iyasu's unstable rule. If he aligned Ethiopia with Muslim powers during World War I, the empire could become a pawn in global politics. A palace coup. In late September, the church and nobility moved together. In Addis Ababa, the Abuna, head of the Orthodox Church, publicly excommunicated Iyasu. This was more than a religious act, it was a political death sentence. An emperor without the blessing of the church could not rule Ethiopia. At the same time, nobles declared that Iyasu had forfeited his throne. In his place, they elevated Empress Zuditu, the daughter of Menelik II, as the new ruler of Ethiopia. To balance power and maintain stability, they named Ras Tafari Makoan as regent and heir. Iyasu, caught off guard, tried to rally his supporters. But unlike his grandfather, he lacked loyal generals and broad alliances. His forces were scattered, and his position crumbled almost overnight. The once celebrated heir of Menelik became a fugitive. Iyasu on the run. For years after his deposition, Iyasu remained a shadowy figure, wandering across Ethiopia as a hunted man. Loyalists tried to protect him, but the nobles and church leaders ensured he would never return to power. He was eventually captured in 1921 and spent the rest of his life in captivity. His downfall was a warning to future rulers. In Ethiopia, legitimacy was not just about bloodline but about balance, respect for the church, the nobility, and the traditions that bound the empire together. The rise of Empress Zuditu. With Iyasu gone, Ethiopia crowned Empress Zuditu in 1916. She became the first woman to rule Ethiopia in centuries, but her reign was shaped by compromise. Zuditu was deeply religious and traditional, a figure who reassured the church and nobles. Yet she was not a forceful ruler in the mold of Menelik. The real power increasingly lay with Ras Tafari Makoan, who, though young, was already demonstrating skill as both a diplomat and a modernizer. While Zuditu symbolized continuity, Tafari represented Ethiopia's future. Ras Tafari steps forward. As regent, Ras Tafari quickly distinguished himself. He reached out to foreign powers, building Ethiopia's diplomatic ties with Europe and beyond. He worked carefully to modernize the state, focusing on education, infrastructure, and military reforms. His calm, measured style won him respect both inside and outside Ethiopia. Where Iyasu had been impulsive, Tafari was patient. Where Iyasu had alienated the church, Tafari worked closely with it. He embodied the balance that Ethiopian politics required. The shadow of Menelik II. Even in these years, the memory of Menelik II loomed large. Every decision by Tafari or Zuditu was judged against the standard he had set. Menelik had defended Ethiopia against foreign conquest and preserved its independence. Now it was up to his successors to ensure the empire did not fracture from within. For ordinary Ethiopians, life went on with both hope and anxiety. They mourned the instability that had followed Menelik's death but looked to Ras Tafari as someone who might restore the empire's strength. The path toward Haile Selassie. By the end of the decade, it was clear that Ras Tafari's star was rising. He had outmaneuvered rivals, gained international recognition, and earned the trust of many Ethiopians. Though still only regent, he was already the true power behind the throne. What began with a coup against Iyasu was slowly turning into a new era. In time, Ras Tafari would become known as Haile Selassie I, one of the most famous figures in African history. But that story belonged to the future. For now, Ethiopia remained in transition, its throne occupied by Empress Zuditu, its destiny guided by the steady hand of her regent. Ethiopia after Iyasu. The coup of 1916 was more than the downfall of a young emperor. It was a turning point in Ethiopian history. It showed the enduring power of the Orthodox Church, the decisive role of the nobility, and the delicate balance that held the empire together. Most of all, it paved the way for the rise of Ras Tafari, who would carry Menelik's legacy forward into the modern age. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, Chapter 10. The eternal legacy of Ethiopia's warrior king. When Emperor Menelik II died in 1913, Ethiopia entered years of uncertainty. His successors struggled with the burdens of ruling an empire he had united and defended. Yet through every twist of politics, every coup, and every power shift, Menelik's presence remained. His victories and reforms had carved his name into the foundation of Ethiopia, and his shadow guided those who came after him. The memory of Adwa. No event defined Menelik II's reign more than the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This single victory, where Ethiopian warriors shattered the Italian army and preserved their independence, became a symbol of hope far beyond the Horn of Africa. For Ethiopians, Adwa was not just a military triumph. It was proof that their empire, their faith, and their culture could withstand the might of Europe at the height of the colonial age. For Africans across the continent, it was a beacon that showed colonialism could be resisted. For the African diaspora, it was a source of pride and dignity, inspiring movements for freedom and equality. Every ruler after Menelik had to measure themselves against that achievement. To this day, Adwa remains one of the most celebrated victories in African history. The empire after Menelik. His grandson, Lij Iyasu, failed to carry forward his legacy. His fall in 1916 showed how fragile the throne could be without wisdom and balance. The nobles and the Orthodox Church instead turned to Empress Zuditu, Menelik's daughter, who symbolized continuity and tradition. The nobles and the Orthodox Church instead turned to Empress Zuditu, Menelik's daughter, who symbolized continuity and tradition. Yet behind Zuditu stood Ras Tafari Makonnen, a young leader who represented Ethiopia's future. While Zuditu reassured the church and conservatives, Tafari began carefully building reforms and forging diplomatic ties. The empire stood between tradition and modernization, a balance Menelik himself had once mastered. The rise of Haile Selassie. Ras Tafari's rise was not immediate, but it was steady. As regent, he worked tirelessly to strengthen Ethiopia's place in the world. By 1930, he would ascend the throne as Emperor Haile Selassie I, one of the most recognized leaders of the 20th century. Haile Selassie carried Menelik's torch forward. He expanded modernization efforts, built Ethiopia's role in international politics, and stood as a voice for African independence during the age of colonialism. In many ways, his reign was the continuation of Menelik's vision, a strong, independent Ethiopia that would not bow to foreign domination. The enduring lessons of Menelik II. What made Menelik II remarkable was not only his battlefield victories but also his vision. He understood that Ethiopia's strength lay in unity. He blended tradition with modernization, built alliances among rival nobles, and forged a sense of national pride. He also recognized the importance of technology and diplomacy. Under his rule, Ethiopia expanded its railways, telegraphs, and modern administration, ensuring the empire would not be left behind. At the same time, he defended Ethiopia's sovereignty with both diplomacy and force, knowing when to negotiate and when to fight. His leadership created the Ethiopia that survived into the modern age. Without Menelik's victories, especially at Adwa, Ethiopia might have been swallowed by colonial powers like so many other African nations. A symbol of resistance. Menelik II's legacy extends far beyond Ethiopia. Across Africa, his name became a symbol of resistance. Leaders in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa spoke of Adwa as proof that Europeans were not invincible. The Rastafari movement, which later looked to Haile Selassie, also revered Menelik as part of Ethiopia's divine kingship and resistance against oppression. In the eyes of many, Menelik was more than an emperor. He was the Lion of Adwa, the king who showed Africa could rise and fight for its dignity. Ethiopia's place in history. By the time Rastafari became Haile Selassie, Ethiopia was firmly established as a symbol of independence. While other nations fell under colonial rule, Ethiopia stood tall, thanks to the foundation Menelik had built. Even during the Italian invasion of 1935, when Mussolini's forces briefly occupied the country, the memory of Menelik's Adwa victory fueled resistance. Haile Selassie carried that spirit to the League of Nations, invoking his grandfather's triumph as proof that Ethiopia's independence was no accident, but the result of courage and sacrifice. The final reflection. Menelik II's reign closed one chapter of Ethiopia's history and opened another. He left behind a country more united, more modern, and more respected than it had been in centuries. His successors struggled, yet even in their failures and victories, his presence was felt. The story of Menelik II is not only the story of Ethiopia but of Africa as a whole. It is the story of how a determined people defended their freedom when the rest of the continent was carved up by foreign empires. It is the story of courage, unity, and vision. The Lion of Adwa lives on. More than a century after his death, Menelik II is remembered not only in Ethiopia but across the world. His statue stands proudly in Addis Ababa, and his name is spoken with reverence by those who study African history. He was not without flaws. His rule had moments of cruelty, and his expansion campaigns left scars. But history remembers him as the emperor who saved Ethiopia's independence and gave Africa one of its proudest victories. Menelik II, the Lion of Adwa, lives on in every celebration of African resistance, every call for independence, and every moment when a people stand firm against oppression. His story is eternal, his legacy unbroken,